Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Cumulus Solutions webinar. My name is Kyle Johnson. I'm the Director of Security Operations and Risk Management for Cumulus. And we also have Brian Mans, who is our Senior Information Security Engineer, and he's going to be walking us through exactly why it's so important to have a vulnerability management program, whether you're working remote or you're on your actual home site. It's very important to understand what's on your network and identify all of those vulnerabilities. But first things, Cumulus is a cybersecurity professional services firm that allows organizations to have access to the people, expertise, and technology that they need in order to assess and even review and implement a information security program. We offer a variety of different services. As you can see, we do a lot in the risk assessment and security assessment realm. We also do policy development, virtual CISO services, employee awareness training, but today is going to be all about vulnerability management. So with that, Brian, I'll let you take it over.
Thank you, Kyle, and welcome everybody. Why implement vulnerability management? Well, we look at vulnerability management. It identifies an organization's technical vulnerabilities. Most people have yet to even start with a vulnerability assessment or vulnerability scan, but to go once you get past the vulnerability assessment, you need to continually identify those vulnerabilities. Why? Because they're constantly coming at us. Just this past month, just in Microsoft, 111 patches, security patches were released. 10 of those were RCEs or remote code executions, which means once that exploit is developed for that security flaw, there is no user interaction needed from the attacker to gain access to the network or vulnerable piece of software. So think about that. And then the past 2 months, 115 security patches and 113 went April and March. And at this point, Microsoft is going to double 2019 in terms of vulnerabilities if they continue the trend of 100 some per month. So it's very important to constantly be identifying those vulnerabilities and understand most networks just aren't Microsoft. They're going to be, Adobe's software. They're going to be Java software. They're going to be Linux. They're going to be Mac OS X. They're going to be iPads, iPhones, anything you can think of that you can put on the network. Okay. Now, vulnerability management, it has 4 main components. Those are identify critical assets, inventory and discovery, identify vulnerabilities on discovered devices, reporting, and remediation. Now, we're going to deep dive into those a little bit here in the next slide. Identify critical assets. When you identify critical assets, you're looking at what has the most sensitive information on our network, or PII, or personal identifiable information. Now, if you're a regulated organization, that would be PCI, HIPAA, or FERPA, respectively. Also, identifying critical assets just isn't about the user information, but does it have a potential for accessing that PCI information, the HIPAA information, the FERPA? So if you have a web server that is on your internal network and it has access to that internal network, and particularly the PCI, HIPAA, and FERPA information, that would be a critical asset. Do others have access to your critical assets? So that would be your end users, any other devices. If you don't have them, your network isolated for a good instance. We're talking about like HVAC systems, IP cameras, all those little things that maybe a third-party vendor may be putting on your machine. Those also could be considered critical assets because they have access to the PCI, HIPAA, and FERPA information. So understand how isolation works and how it can help you reduce the amount of servers or devices that are critical assets. Determine who owns the systems. This is important. I've had many times where IT and this is when I was in IT, where a simple manual configuration on a user's laptop could have left us not necessarily with a breach, but some pretty private information. They had manually mapped a web drive to for board private meetings, and in that it had what the board had planned on doing with the school, little things that staff and employees weren't supposed to be privy to. So understand, you have to have that relationship with your internal departments, such as your accounting, your administration, especially HR. You're going to get in there and you're going to have those conversations and try to develop that relationship so that you understand that, hey, this is private information. It doesn't belong over here. It needs to be protected to the best of our abilities. Also, speaking of ownership, vendors, a lot of, and I'm not talking just about IT vendors. I'm talking, you get a maintenance department. If you're in a school or a hospital, you have your cafeteria. They also bring in stuff. They have wireless devices that will connect to a network and tell you the temperature of the cooler. So, I mean, it's just not IT that needs the vendors, but all the vendors that are across the board. And maybe accounting has something out there, a particular piece of software. And you need to understand, you need to have a working relationship with them so they understand how often they should be doing their updates and what type of configurations. And that maybe, hey, we're going to be scanning you. So just an FYI, we're looking at how often that happens. Now, I will tell you, many moons ago, when I worked in healthcare, and we were going through the WannaCry back in 2017, I worked probably a solid month with a particular pharmacist vendor, and it wasn't my vendor. It was the pharmacy's department's vendor. So I had to work through the director there, and we went through rounds after rounds of trying to eradicate any pharmacist machines that was vulnerable to WannaCry. So it's very important to understand that just because it's not directly in IT's crosshairs, there should be some, whether it's a security department or it's the IT team. If you don't have a security team, you need to be aware and include those vendors so that you can get those vulnerabilities out of there. Because remember, if they're not isolated from your critical assets, they then become a critical asset as well. Okay. How often should you scan? Well, how often should you scan? It depends. Understand your organization's installed technology. What does that mean? You have Microsoft. Well, that's monthly. If you have something that comes out often, like let's say Java updates, and I hope that you're still not using Java, but there may be something else like I believe Chrome and Firefox. They update, I'd say, on a bi-monthly basis. If you're worried about that, I mean, it depends on the risk that you're willing to take with potential exploits. Okay. Is your organization's regulated? I can tell you only one of the three that are mentioned at the top of this slide have any information based on how often you need to scan, and that would be PCI, which is 4 times a year internal. HIPAA doesn't really give you an ongoing maintenance. FERPA, no, not even close. So let's look next at inventory and discovery. This is probably where I like to do this. And even as an IT person, I always did inventory and discovery whenever, let's say, I moved on to the next job. Why? Because I needed to know what is on this network. I wanted to discover things. What is this? And then you can ask the questions if it's something that seems a little bit off on the network. Maybe it doesn't match the naming convention of the IT department. So what can you do by doing inventory discovery? You can identify services running. By identifying services, you see what's running. Is it a web server? What type of web server is it? Is it a wireless controller? Is it a switch? All kinds of things. Identify ownership. Very important to identify ownership. because if you don't know who's supposed to be taking care of it, you're not going to have the ability to help work with that particular vendor and say, hey, you need to update your firmware or change your defaults. Identify operating system and firmware level. So by doing these inventory discoveries, you can identify operating system or firmware. Now, depending on whether it's an authenticated scan or non-authenticated scan, and I'll discuss that later. Third-party vendors, what department works with this vendor? Understand it's not going to be just IT that works with this vendor. It may be maintenance, the cafeteria, the accounting department, administration. It could be all kinds of different things. I worked at a school where the assistant principal was in charge because it was a program, I think through the state, that allowed us to purchase IP cameras. Now, you may need to be working with those different individuals. You just need to find out what devices, and this is what an inventory discovery does. It really opens up your eyes in terms of what's on your network. I didn't know we had that on the network. I didn't know we had that on the network. How many times I've gone into an infrastructure, plugged in, and did a scan, and when you come back with the information, you start asking the questions, what is this device? And some of the people have been there for a while. I'm not sure where did that come from. So, I mean, this is why you do it. The next question is, does the vendor have remote access to the device? Because you may want to, well, if you're accessing our network, we want to scan your machine. Is his machine updated? I mean, or is he back to 2017 with the WannaCry patch that hasn't been installed yet? How often does the vendor come on site? That would give you an opportunity, if you can't scan across the VPN, to scan them on the network, or to talk to them about certain items such as updating, what their policies are, just getting that personal connection. Is network inventory important? Yes. If you don't know about it, how can you protect it? If a vendor just comes in, throws it in, doesn't change any of the defaults, and that firmware is never updated, or operating system, in that matter of fact, how do you protect that? How do you know, do they have antivirus on that machine? What are they doing on your network that potentially could lead you to a breach? So those are the things you got to think about. And the biggest thing, and I said this many moons ago in education, is if you're not scanning it, someone else will do it for you. And how do I know that? Why do I believe that? Because I managed firewalls, and when managing firewalls, I would always, any IPS event, I would have thrown back to my email. Sometimes I'd get 2,000 in within 20 minutes. Not necessarily the best thought process, but I'm monitoring the IPS, and you could see when somebody would just come across all your external IP, especially when you have web-based interfaces out there that they are scanning, and you see the same. Okay, here we come. We're coming from this country. We're coming from that country, and that usually would throw up a red flag with me. So I know somebody is always knocking at that virtual door, so to speak, of your network infrastructure. And if they get in, it'll be the same thing. They're going to be doing, it's the same process. Once I get in to your network, I'm going to start scanning that internal network. And if I have access to everything, I'm going to be scanning everything and finding the weakest point and then move on from there. Now, and that's when we need to identify vulnerabilities on the discovered devices, okay? And there's two types of scans that people talk about when doing a vulnerability scan: an authenticated scan and an unauthenticated scan. An authenticated scan identifies third-party vulnerabilities. Why? Because I can authenticate to that machine, and I can pull those products such as Adobe Reader, Java, and any other application that may be installed on that operating system, and go, okay, this is really out of date. This is, Firefox is like 10 versions behind. And it does, an authenticated scan does have a better chance of properly identifying the operating system. Why? Because it's authenticated. You can see the host information and have a better chance. It's also less noise on the network. Why? Because it's not using ports to discover the operating system, the vulnerabilities. Everything's done between the scanner machine and the machine that is being tested. Okay. An unauthenticated scan, it does give you the point of view from an attacker who has not obtained credentials. Example, I'm a third party vendor. I'm on an HVAC system. I got an infected laptop. I plug in, and next thing you know, you're getting scanned. Okay. When you get scanned, that person doesn't have the credentials. So it's going to be a little bit noisy. If you've got SIM, you should be able to see that type of process happening in the background. If you don't have SIM, then you won't know about it. But they're going to be scanning you and looking for those open holes. It's going to be noisy, yeah. Do they have a less chance of identifying the operating system? Yeah, because it's not authenticated. You're not going to be able to go in there and do a system info on the machine and pull that because you're not authenticated. More noise on the network. Why? Because you're coming across the network and you're looking at open ports. So what I mean by open ports is, let's say I'm coming across to a Windows machine. We're talking 445, 139, 137, any other port you may have open. Now, in most cases, it's been my understanding is that 445 is where I'm pulling what Windows machine you have there, right? So, and the other things that it may identify as well from 445 is, do you support SMB version 1? If you do, you're probably potentially an older version of Windows. If you don't support SMB version 1, then you may be more along the lines of 2012 or 2016. Okay. Printers, IoT, IP cameras, and HVAC. Now, we use Nessus Scanner. These are choices you have to make when doing a vulnerability scan. And some people, no, we don't want to do that, but understand these, anytime I've scanned printers, IoT, IP cameras, HVACs, I find more default configurations than I do with anything else. Why? Third-party vendor. Printers are usually third-party vendors. IP cameras, third-party vendors come and place them. Now, I have at some facilities done IP cameras by myself, and I don't install them with default configurations. Now, not only default configurations, default services running. So you got Bonjour, you got this service, you got NTP running, you got all these, you got about 12, 15 different services that are running that potentially you may not need. So these are big issues. Now, not only that, one of the things specifically with printers, which it's a pain point with me when I look at this, but printers, SNMP with the default public community of public, I see that a lot. What can I get with that? I can get user information. I can get what operating system, what firmware version, which allows me to do what? Go and look for exploits. See, here's the thing with identifying vulnerabilities. The less information you give to an attacker, the less opportunity they have, or less chance they have to exploit that. Hope that makes sense. Now on to the reporting, which is where the rubber starts to meet the road, because we're giving you the information, telling you this is critical, and how to discern that information. Now, vulnerability scans are based on CVSS version 3.1 scale. That's a common vulnerability security scanning system. Okay. In that, it identifies vulnerabilities from low, medium, high to critical. Now, there's a number-based system there. So, and you can find more at first.org, but it helps identify the order of remediation if you don't have other factors, such as what we discussed in identifying critical assets. Understand, identifying critical assets is pretty important. And if you have something that's maybe not a critical asset, obviously that should fall to the back. Weaponization, that's another thing. Most vulnerability assessments don't get into weaponization. That's That's beyond vulnerability assessments or management, but weaponization. Now, one of the nice things that we have with the software that we use is it gives you weaponization. What does that mean? It basically tells you whether that vulnerability, let's go for instance, let's do Bluekeep. Bluekeep is exploitable according to Metasploit. There is an exploit out there for it within Metasploit. Metasploit is a piece of open source software that allows you to run exploits, even scans, import a Nessus scan. And it's, like I said, it's open source, so anybody can download it. Core Impact is a paid for service. Canvas, a paid for service. Exploit-db.com. What is that? Well, you go there and you type in, let's say, Windows 7, right? You type in Windows 7 and you'll find that all the exploits or privilege escalations, those types of things are out there for Windows 7. Okay, and it's a manual process though at that point. Exploits or weaponization, they're mainly in criticals and highs. I have seen a few in medium, but never in low. Okay, so criticals and highs. So that's usually where it falls into. Now, and we'll get into, does a high exploitable trump a critical here shortly. Solutions. Update, update, update. I would say probably 8 out of 10 times those are the solutions that is recommended, whether it be Java, Windows, patch, those types of things. Always do your updates. So that's kind of some of the things. Now, the second most common thing is disable if not using. Well, that would be Telnet. You shouldn't be using Telnet. FTP, you shouldn't be using FTP. Why? Because you can pick up the password in clear text, okay? You're still using what? Now, in terms of this, on the networks that I have, where I was in IT, and even going forth into security, I still have those moments. You're still using what? And that could be a Windows 2000 machine. I've seen them. I've had to start them, and I'm like, why? You can't have this on. This is critical. Or XP machines. When I worked in healthcare, I unfortunately had the bad news of saying I couldn't get tech support on a particular piece of radiology machine because the operating system was so old that when I tried to go download the remote support, it didn't display it correctly, and I couldn't download it. And I had to go back and tell the IT director, I'm sorry, I can't get this one to work. I'm going to have to do whatever updates are on it. And if you've ever worked in healthcare, they tell you, well, when you update the operating system, you got to update the machine, which is $250,000 or $500,000, depending on which machine it is. And that usually sends up that's an acceptable risk flag. Okay. Now on to the remediation. This is where the rubber does meet the road. Where to start are the vulnerabilities on the critical device. We talked about this. We identify your critical assets. That's where the information that you, if it got into the wrong hands and was displayed on the first page of the newspaper, that you lost your information. That's your critical devices. Are the vulnerabilities internet facing and have access to an internal network? That's the foothold into your network. Hopefully you get it on the DMZ, but if you don't understand, at that point, it becomes a critical device. Are devices isolated on the network? Do you have that HVAC system or maintenance network isolated so that it cannot connect to those critical devices such as your PCI information, your FERPA, or your HIPAA information, right? What's the cost to remediate? Now, this is usually where we get into, yeah, that's an acceptable risk. Been there, done that. We can't upgrade that quite yet. Vulnerability assessment. I've been on the customer side of a vulnerability assessment where that previous said device where I said I couldn't get it to connect came up as you need to get rid of that. And it was explained, no, we're going to have to wait a year. Now, what would be the course of action for something like that? Well, if you go up to the previous question, are vulnerable devices isolated on the network? That's your course of action. Isolate it so that it can't access other resources other than what it only needs. And if it's joined to Active Directory, you might want to look at disjoining that particular machine, because understand, once they get a hold of one machine, then it's just pivoting to the other machines on the network. Okay. What to do after you've done your remediations, configuration changes, migrations? Well, you begin the process again. You scan it again, you verify that the vulnerabilities were remediated. You may find some that keep on popping up, and it may need to be investigated again. But at least you know that you've made changes and your network has moved forward versus vulnerabilities. And understand, once you start moving forward, you start peeling back and looking at what's underneath, what you got going on in your network. It's going to be a lot easier once you get that process going. And the nice thing is, when somebody else is scanning you that you may not want scanning you, it's going to be a lot tougher time for them to find holes. And understand, when an attacker, they want the easy way in. If you make it hard for them, it's going to be, let's move on to the next target or the next organization. Start process over based on frequency of your organization. Like I said, PCI says you only have to internal 4 times. Now, I know some of the organizations I know about, they may do it on a monthly basis. They may do it on a weekly basis. It just depends on what your organization says you should be doing it, or whether on how you're regulated. I thank you. And if you guys have any questions for Cumulus Services, you can contact us at info@cumulusolutions.com. Thank you, and have a good day.